Hey everyone, welcome to Bumbling Through Dungeons. My name is Mark. I'm wearing my glasses today. That's new. I don't think I've done that in a video before. But today is going to be what I think will be a pretty short video, but one that I wanted to cover on homebrew versus official adventures, and with the angle of saying that homebrew is easier. So let's talk about that a little bit, because that statement itself is probably a little bit false, but it can be true for you, and that's what the video is about. So I make this video because I think there is a preconception in D&D that homebrewing an adventure, coming up with it on your own, where you're building it from scratch, whether that's building an entire world or building a single city or town or using an established adventure setting and making your own adventure in it, regardless of which one of those it is, that is the more advanced skill, that is the more difficult skill. And the entry-level skill, if you will, or at least a slightly closer to entry-level skill, is DMing a game where you're using an official adventure, where you're using a pre-generated adventure. It's right there out in front of you. You can just read from it if you need to, but you have something to reference in order to run the adventure. And you can certainly make it your own. You can tweak things here or there, but the idea is that for the most part, you're using something that somebody else came up with. And I see this mentality permeate the entire hobby, where people think, okay, well, what's the easiest adventure for me to jump into and run? And there are some that are going to be easier than others, some that require more prep work, more knowledge, more information, more high-level DMing skill. I think anyone, if they're passionate enough and interested enough, can run pretty much anything that's out there. So I don't know that there's a gigantic barrier to entry, but there are definitely some that are harder than others. But we're not talking necessarily about what's the easiest or hardest pre-gen adventure or official adventure. We're talking about what you might be able to do to make homebrewing an adventure just as easy, or in some cases easier, than running an official adventure. And the other big reason that I want to talk about this is because, and my friends who I play D&D with will know this to be true, homebrew is easier for me. I actually prefer it in terms of the amount of time I know I'm going to have to commit to preparing it. I actually prefer to do homebrew adventures as opposed to pre-generated adventures or official adventures, and there's a couple reasons for that. And I think talking about those is going to help you, viewer, understand what I'm talking about when I say, hey, you can make homebrewing easy, because I'm going to talk about the things that I don't need to do with a homebrew adventure that I do need to do with an official adventure. So from the very start, if you're homebrewing an adventure, the idea is up here, and you know what you want to bring to life. Now, of course, the players are going to interact with that idea. It's not going to be you just telling the story, but you have an idea for an adventure, maybe a whole world or a setting for it, and it's all up here. You understand it, and you might be building it, you might be tweaking it, adjusting it, changing it, but it's more or less in your head, and you understand each of the plot beats, the major NPCs, the major players in this world. Something about it is interesting to you enough that you're thinking about it. So right away, you're a little bit ahead of an official adventure, because you get the book and somebody else's big idea is in there and it's not yours. And the first thing you're going to have to do is read it. And, that doesn't take a whole lot of time, but you're not just having to read it. You are having to read it to the extent that you understand the adventure at a level where you can run it. So knowing the general structure of the narrative is a little bit different than knowing it in a way that will let you run it at your table organically. That means understanding the connections between the NPCs or factions or heroes and villains, and how those might interact throughout the course of the adventure. It might mean the different setting locations and names and places and how those interact, different motivations. There are a ton of pieces of information in any adventure book, some of which can be hundreds of pages long. And a lot of it's interesting, a lot of it's great, but it's a lot to keep in your head when it's not your original idea. So I think that's the first part. Now, because it's all written out for you, you have it all there. So if you're running it at the table and you don't remember something, it is in the book. You can reference it And there are a lot of passages that are intended for you to read aloud verbatim or close to verbatim. So this is fine. You can read verbatim from the book, and you can get through a lot of these sections where you're never going to be able to absorb all the information and keep it up in your head. But to me, it's actually cooler if you don't have to do that. And this is one of the big reasons why I like homebrewing, is that I don't have all the details written out, but I can come up with them because I know I'm going to come up with things that won't clash with other information in the adventure. And I can do that on the spot. I can improvise it more easily. If I improvise something for an official adventure and then I later read through the book and find out, oh crap, something that I made up clashes with this other bit of information they got, or with this plot hook that they have to get later on, it messes up X, Y, or Z, I might be able to pivot, but if I'm trying to stay in the adventure, then I'm going to have to figure out how to reconcile that thing that I came up with whatever's in the book. So it discourages improvisation to a certain extent. Obviously, you're improvising to a certain extent regardless of what you're running. But if you are running in completely different directions sometimes with your improv, or saying, oh, that makes a whole lot of sense, let's go this direction, in a homebrew campaign, you can make it work because it's all just up here and you are kind of making it up as you go along. Whereas in an official adventure, you might zig when the book thinks you're going to zag, and then those two things are at odds and you have to reconcile them somehow. So I've run into trouble when I've run official adventures where I will run with something that the players are doing, but then it will create complications with, oh man, well, if we're going to stay on the book, this is now a problem. I have to figure out some new thing to insert into the adventure that has everything make sense. And I've been able to do that, but it's extra work. And that's kind of the point, is that, I don't need any read aloud text. I don't need to have anything written out to read verbatim because it is all up here. So I think that's the biggest thing. I want to, when I sit down at the table to run a game, I want to be able to be in the moment reacting to player decisions. And for me, that's easier when I'm not having to reference a book. When I understand enough of what's going on in the adventure that I can come up with it on the fly, and I don't need to, reference, okay, what does this NPC know? Or what is the description for this tomb, etc., etc. And you can get to this point with official adventures. You can get to the point where enough of it, maybe not all of it, but enough of it is up in your head that you can just run without having to reference the book that often. You can just have a handful of notes as you would normally, and you can sort of be reacting in ways that will make sense. But getting to that point is going to require more work to understand it at a very deep level. So I like to get to this point when I'm running official adventures, but that requires not just one read through for me, but 2, sometimes 3 full read throughs of the book. And the first time I'm just figuring out how everything sort of loosely connects together. The second time I'm creating a more granular map of NPCs and plot hooks and how those interact. And the third time I'm probably cutting and pasting if it's digital, or highlighting and making notes and typing things and writing things down, and I'm probably writing in the book itself, and I'm getting it into some form that I'm going to be able to run. And that's a lot of work. Not just reading through it 3 times, but reading through it 3 times very carefully and stopping very frequently in order to take those notes, in order to pull the information out in a way that's going to be manageable for you. Now, maybe I've got it backwards. Maybe I've got it backwards somehow, because I have talked to people for whom homebrew is very, very difficult. Or maybe not homebrew is very difficult, but the official adventures that Wizards of the Coast comes out with are easier for them to run because everything is there for them and a bunch of ideas are there for them to be able to draw from. And I think this starts to speak to different styles of DMing. And your threshold for what you want to do and what you're comfortable with and what works best for you is going to be different than for me. It's going to be different from the next guy over and the next girl over there and whoever else is DMing. Each is going to have their own little spin on it. But I still, when I see how easy it is for me to do a homebrew campaign relative to the work I put into an official campaign, I can't shake the feeling that some people are making homebrew too difficult on themselves, and that they're putting too much pressure to write the sort of adventure that they see in those books. And you can run an adventure that's as cool as what's in those books, but you don't need to write all that out. Hell, you don't even need to think through all of that, because you'll be making up a lot of it as you go through it with your players. And so I think that you can have a lot less to start with. And if you are invested enough in the story that's being told at the table collaboratively with your players, that you're going to be able to build off of it in interesting ways and have little points here or there where you have prepped stuff out, but it doesn't need to be as fully fleshed out, because you're not writing it for an audience of thousands, which is what Wizards of the Coast is doing. When they write an adventure, they need to make sure that the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, I don't know how many people play D&D. I know it's a lot, but however many thousands of people are running these adventures, they need to be able to write a book that all of them are going to be able to run. And therefore, there's probably a lot more information than there needs to be for any one DM. Where if you just have the sort of skeleton of the plot and the major encounters, plot beats, whatever it is, settings, then you can probably get through it and run something that's just as interesting without all of those ancillary details, without the 60,000 more words that are in some of those books, you know. So to me, that's where the disconnect is. I get that there is a safety net of, all right, I'm running an adventure and it's all right here in front of me. And sure, I can do my own thing if I want, but whenever I need it, that material's there. So I get that comfort level of having an official adventure. And if that's going to be more inside your safety zone, your comfort zone, then absolutely go for it. But what I would say to anyone who's curious about it would be really consider running a homebrew adventure, and consider the fact that you're not going to need as much information to start with and throughout the campaign as you will when you're trying to absorb and run an official D&D 5th edition adventure. Or really, this is true of many adventures that I've read and played in from past editions, where it was very similar. You know, you had a bunch of stuff, and you might not need all of that. You might only need 30% of it. And if you can get to that 30% mark in your head and in your notes, it doesn't need to make sense to anyone else, as long as you understand where you're going. So that would be my advice, because I see a lot of people very wary to dip their toes into homebrew waters. And I started with homebrew, and I wasn't great at it by a long shot, but it's been more gratifying to me to run homebrew adventures, and I think I've gotten to the point where I'm more comfortable running homebrew because of those elements, because it's easier for me to react organically to what's happening at the table, rather than feeling like I need to be true to what's written on the page by somebody else. And of course, all of this is not to say that there aren't really great 5th edition adventures. There are some that I really and truly love and enjoy, and I've pulled a lot of ideas out of them. There's some that I've run in full. There's some that I've played in full. They've all been very fun, and I do also enjoy pulling ideas out from those adventures and throwing them into my homebrew. So, you know, when you are homebrewing something, another thing to remember is that you're not alone. There are 100 ideas that you can pull together and mash together in some unique way that makes it yours, even though there are individual elements that are pulled from other sources. So I think that's a big thing that people sometimes get caught up on. There are entire modules, entire arcs that I've lifted from other adventures and then tweaked to my purposes and run as a homebrew campaign. And of course, there are other sessions that I've run that are ones that I've come up with completely from scratch. So you can mix and match those to your liking, but it doesn't need to be all things that you come up with out of nowhere. So we've talked a little bit in the past about coming up with adventures, and I did a video recently called Setting the Stage, and I think that's a good one for talking about how you can go about running a homebrew campaign that's going to be minimal prep. And So I would encourage you to check that out. I'll link it down in the description, or if I can figure out how to do the YouTube card thing at the end of the video, wherever it is, over here, I'll have that be one of the videos that comes up. But I think that's a good one for walking through how you can do something that is very low prep, but still has a lot of interesting things going on in it, in a homebrew setting, in a homebrew campaign. So without going into too much detail of how you then prep a homebrew campaign, that would be its own video. And I think some of the other videos that I've done do speak to that, but I think it's a little bit beyond the purview of this topic. But otherwise, I hope you have a lot of fun running whatever type of campaign you want to do, whether it's a hybrid campaign, a pre-gen campaign, a homebrew campaign. And if you are thinking about it, saying, well, I'm not sure I can do a homebrew, then I would encourage you, take the plunge, see how it goes. You might actually find that it is easier for you than running some of those official adventures. But regardless, I hope you have a great time. And until next time, take care.